Let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to master what is arguably the single most important foundation of all maritime law. If you're completely new to international law, or if you're just looking for a really structured, comprehensive deep dive, you are absolutely in the right place. Because today, we are zeroing in on one very specific, crucial concept, the baseline. And honestly, I literally cannot overstate this. A baseline matters more than any other concept in this entire subject. Why? Because every single maritime zone, the territorial sea, the contiguous zone, the exclusive economic zone, the continental shelf, they are all measured outward from it. If you get the baseline wrong, well, every single zone built on top of it is wrong too. It is the absolute geographic and legal foundation that everything else sits on. Here's how we're going to break this down today. First, the foundation of baselines. Second, irregular coasts and case law. Third, bays, rivers, and archipelagos. Fourth, elevations, reefs, and harbors. Fifth, legal effects and state practice. And we'll finish up with a complete topic recap. All right, let's get into it. Part 1, the foundation of baselines. So, before we get tangled up in all the complex exceptions, we really need to understand the default rule. This is the rule that governs the vast majority of coastlines worldwide. To picture this, I want you to imagine drawing a chalk line on the sand, right at the absolute furthest point the ocean retreats on a beach. When the tide goes all the way out, that exact line where the water meets the shore, that's your starting point. It's a very simple, physical reality. But of course, in international law, we need highly precise terminology. So, our chalk line example is legally defined under UNCOLO's Article 5 as the normal baseline. The precise rule is that the normal baseline is the low water line along the coast, exactly as marked on large-scale charts officially recognized by the coastal state. Think of it as your baseline, so to speak. Moving on to Part 2, irregular coasts and case law. Okay, but what happens when the coastline isn't just a smooth, predictable beach, but a jagged, fragmented mess? Imagine if you tried to trace the low water mark of every single deep, winding inlet on a heavily fractured coast. The resulting maritime zones would just look like a chaotic jigsaw puzzle. It'd be completely unworkable. Instead, imagine playing a giant game of connect the dots across the outermost tips of that shattered coastline. You essentially bypass all those deep inlets and simply connect the jutting points. And that exact connect the dots analogy is legally codified as Article 7, straight baselines. The strict rule states that straight baselines are used where the coastline is deeply indented or cut into, or where there is a fringe of islands right close to the coast. You draw straight lines joining appropriate points, but, and this is absolutely key, those lines must follow the general direction of the coast. Now, this method only exists in international law because of one very specific historic case. Meet the absolute most cited precedent in this entire topic, the Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case of 1951 between the UK and Norway, heard at the International Court of Justice. The facts here are actually really fascinating. Norway's coast is famously deep with fjords and completely fringed by thousands of islands, a formation known as the Skaregard. Trying to apply the normal low water line there was practically impossible. So the issue before the court was whether Norway could lawfully deviate from the normal low water line and draw straight lines connecting its outermost island points instead. The holding? The ICJ upheld Norway's straight baseline system, stating it was perfectly consistent with international law. And the significance of this cannot be overstated. That specific ruling formed the exact doctrinal basis that was later codified almost verbatim as UN Class Article 7. That brings us to Part 3, bays, rivers, and archipelagos. Let's look at how this legal framework builds when we encounter specific geographical features like large water bodies. Think of these next rules as shutting a legal gate. First, when a river flows directly into the sea, Article 9 says you just draw a straight line right across the river's mouth, straight between points on the low water line of the banks. Easy enough. Bays, however, are a bit more complex. Under Article 10, to draw a bay closing line, the bay must be considered a juridical bay. To qualify, it has to pass a specific semicircle test, meaning the water area inside the indentation must be at least equal to a semicircle drawn using the mouth of the bay as its diameter. If it passes that test, you can draw a closing line of up to 24 nautical miles across the mouth, firmly shutting that gate and separating the ocean from inland waters. Oh, and it's worth noting that historic bays, basically bays a state has historically claimed for a very long time, they are entirely exempt from this 24-mile size limit under Article 10, Paragraph 6. So what if a nation is made entirely of islands, like Indonesia or the Philippines? Well, essentially, you draw a grand perimeter fence around the whole nation. Under Article 47, these are called archipelagic baselines. They are straight lines joining the outermost points of the outermost islands. But you can't just draw these wherever you want. There are strict metrics. The water-to-land ratio inside this new fence must be between 1:1 and 9:1. Plus, the line segments themselves can generally only be up to 100 nautical miles long. They do allow up to 3% of the segments to reach 125 nautical miles, but that's the absolute max. All right, moving right along to Part 4, elevations, reefs, and harbors. Now, large landmasses aren't our only concern here. Even disappearing rocks and man-made structures have their own highly specific legal rules. Let's imagine a vanishing stepping stone out in the ocean. Legally, this is termed a low tide elevation under Article 13. It's defined as land naturally above water at low tide, but completely submerged at high tide. So, can you measure a maritime zone from it? Well, the rule is incredibly strict. It only generates a baseline point if it already lies wholly or partly within a territorial sea measured from the mainland or an island. If it's just sitting way out in the open ocean all on its own, it generates absolutely no maritime zone whatsoever. What about things like coral walls or massive concrete docks? Under Article 6, for islands situated on atolls or those with fringing reefs, the baseline is actually pushed out to the seaward low water line of the reef itself. And for human-made structures, Article 11 states that permanent harbor works that form an integral part of a harbor system actually legally count as part of the coast. Section 5. Legal effects and state practice. Okay, so we've drawn all these intricate lines, but honestly, why does it even matter? Why does aggressive baseline drawing trigger so many fierce international disputes? Well, this brilliantly illustrates the spatial logic of the ocean. The baseline basically acts as a vital hinge. Looking landward, meaning inside the baseline, those waters become internal waters. And internal waters are treated essentially like dry land territory, meaning foreign vessels have absolutely no right of innocent passage there. But looking seaward, outside the baseline, that is where the maritime zones begin. The 12 nautical mile territorial sea, the 24 nautical mile contiguous zone, the 200 nautical mile EEZ, and the continental shelf. Pushing the baseline outward effectively pushes every single one of those massive, resource-rich zones outward too. It expands a nation's sovereign reach in a huge way. We can really see the impact of this in how states actually practice these laws. Let's compare true archipelagic states with mainland states, using India as a really prime example here. Under UNCLOS Part 4, true archipelagic states, like Indonesia for instance, are constituted wholly by archipelagos, so they get to utilize Article 47. Now, India is not an archipelagic state in that sense, right? It's primarily a massive mainland. However, under its 1976 Maritime Zones Act, India applies straight baseline principles to sections of its mainland coast, and it specifically draws straight lines around its island groups, like the Andaman and Nicobar chains. This perfectly shows how states navigate and apply these definitions to maximize their own territorial security and resources. But what happens when the physical Earth essentially betrays the legal map? This brings us to a massively important live contemporary issue. If baselines follow the low water line and climate-induced sea level rise physically moves that line inland, do a nation's maritime zones legally shrink? Well, Pacific small island developing states have taken a very firm stance on this. In their 2021 Pacific Islands Forum Declaration, they asserted that once baselines are properly established and deposited with the UN, they should be preserved regardless of subsequent physical coastal change. The International Law Commission is actually studying this profound intersection of sea level rise and international law right now, and the question remains unresolved today. It's a huge deal. Which brings us to our final section, a complete topic recap. We have covered some immense ground today. Let's lock in everything we've learned by methodically reviewing these rules in teaching order. First, we had the normal baseline, Article 5. That's your default low water line found on official large-scale charts. Second, straight baselines, Article 7. These are used for deeply indented coasts, drawing lines that follow the coast's general direction. Third, bay closing lines, Article 10. This is the legal gate up to 24 nautical miles wide, permitted if the bay passes that semicircle test. And remember, historic bays are completely exempt from that limit. Fourth, river mouths, Article 9, a straight line drawn right across the low water banks where a river meets the sea. Continuing our recap, we covered Article 47, archipelagic baselines, connecting the outermost points of outermost islands, strictly adhering to those water-to-land ratios and length maximums. Then, Article 13, low tide elevations, those vanishing rocks that only count if they sit within an already existing territorial sea. We also looked at Articles 6 and 11, which push the line out to seaward reefs and permanent harbor works. And finally, tying our whole irregular coast framework together, never forget that foundational precedent, the 1951 Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case, which legally justified straight baselines and directly shaped Article 7. You now possess a highly rigorous, comprehensive understanding of exactly how nations draw their borders in the ocean. But before we wrap up, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought that makes mastering this law so incredibly vital right now. As sea levels continue to rise and physically erase those literal low water marks, will international law evolve to freeze these baselines in place, or will vulnerable island nations be forced to watch their sovereign maritime zones slowly wash away? It's a question that bridges rigid legal doctrine with the very fluid, changing reality of our world. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer, and I look forward to exploring the next maritime topic with you soon.